Again, I read those books when I was younger. That's kind of what drew me into this mystery. But the more I began to look at other people's work, they're beginning to question Sitchin's work. And I'm not talking about from a skeptical point of view. From an academic point of view, let's say, what does Sitchin call this? And he would call it something. But they said, but that's not what the word means, not in any length or shape or form. And he began to manipulate the story in order to fit that theory. And that's where you have to sort of draw the line with Sitchin. But again, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think he helped us focus on a period of human history where no one had really questioned before. So his work is very useful. But again, part of it you also have to begin to question because it doesn't make any sense. It gets into that sort of conspiracy theory and personal opinion. Now, it's great having opinions and it's great to do some conjecture, but there's so much conjecture that we start losing track of the facts, and that's where I like to go back to the original texts and find out what they were saying and put myself out of the equation. I don't want to give my opinion and add to the muddle. I want to go back to the original stories and see how they cross-reference around the world, because if you start cross-referencing things in different cultures, they begin to make a lot of sense. If you let them speak for themselves, they make a lot of sense.
Where does New Zealand fit into all of this, Freddie?
Oh, this was a huge surprise. I had no idea this was coming. I spent 6 trips to New Zealand. I was given a book that was the written tradition of a group of people called the Waitaha. No one's ever heard of them. They originated in Easter Island. They actually describe being on Easter Island before the flood. So this story goes back to 12,000 years at least. And they describe how back in the day, they used to every year welcome the canoe of the gods. They used to come from some big landmass, which is now sunk in the middle of the Pacific. And they used to give out knowledge and information, and they used to elevate the tribe. And then they used to disappear somewhere called the birthplace of the gods. Now, fast forward, the flood happens. They describe the events of the flood, the fact that the gods were in the middle of the Pacific when the flood hit, and they were lucky enough to be in deep water, so they were able to survive and reach New Zealand. Now, a couple of generations go by. Their progeny show up back on Easter Island. There was one woman called Hotu Matua. Nice to have a female sort of hero for a change. And she basically was described as the net of the world. She was a master navigator, comes from somewhere to the northwest of the Pacific, and her job was to map the Pacific, because where there used to be land masses, now there were islands. Now, this is an incredible story. And she is described as being very unusual, very tall, red-headed, blue-eyed, white-skinned. And in the meantime, there's another god, another progeny of the gods that survives the flood, comes from a big landmass in the east, which I presume to be South America. They met on the Easter Islands, and then their son decides to figure out, we need to go back to New Zealand to honor the birthplace of the gods. And you follow the trail of the story back to the South Island of New Zealand, to this incredible, incredible landscape temple. I can't get enough of it. And I read more of the Waitaha story, and they were saying that this is a place where the gods basically were born. It's an incredible sight. But the thing that really stood out for me in the story was that they said that there was a calendar stone there. Now,
hold on right there, Freddie. We're at the top of the hour already, but we'll let you finish that story. We'll take phone calls, and we'll talk more about The Missing Lands by Freddie Silva.
Never miss a detail on a show or a guest. Sign up for the Coast Zone email news.
Egyptian word called a navigator. And he gets there, and he sets up a calendar stone. Now, this is in the Waitaha Traditions, which has just been published. And I went there looking for this calendar stone. There's a lot of stones there. I have to look for a calendar stone. And I believe I found it. And one of the 3 alignments that it gives me was extraordinary, because the first time that you see one of the 2 prime constellations in that part of the world, and one of them is a Southern Cross, of course, but the other big constellation in the Pacific is Orion, same as in Egypt. And the alignment of this calendar stone to the complete first rising of the constellation of Orion over the horizon is 10,400 BC in the winter solstice. Now, anyone that's familiar with the work of Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert already is familiar with that date, because that's the date that's given for the blueprint of the 3 pyramids at Giza. So one has to wonder now, what is the connection between the Egyptians and the gods of New Zealand? Well, they are described described exactly the same way physically. They all have the same nickname of Shining Ones, and they also appear in South America, in Lake Titicaca, because it's mentioned in the Waitaha traditions that whenever they went back to Easter Island, because of the way that the currents flow, they couldn't go back to Easter Island. They had to go to South America because they already had a homeland there for a long, long time. And they used to take two totem birds with them as a token of good luck. And the birds were called Titi and Kaka, which of course we know as Lake Titicaca.
That's right.
Exactly, and they already had the homeland there. The archaeologist Arthur Poznansky did a lot of work at Tiwanaku, the main site at Lake Titicaca. He took one of the main sites and he aligned it to the horizon stars, and he got a date of 15,000 BC. Now, this is interesting because if they were going backwards and forwards to Easter Island, New Zealand, and possibly Egypt, because again, they were master navigators, they were described in the same way, they had the same physical characteristics, they had the same nicknames. It's interesting that when I learned what the original name of Tiwanaku means, it means my people in Aymara. I have a very good guide in the South America who knows his language. And I said, but yeah, that's very interesting, my people. But Aku, the Tiwa and Aku, that's not an Aymara name. He says, no, you're right. I said, that's an Egyptian word that means shining one, which is the nickname of the Anunnaki and also the followers of Horus in Egypt. And he said, that's interesting. So that means that Tiwanaku literally means the city of my shining people. So now we have a lot of connected things here, which is why I found this project so exciting. You have now the same gods in South America being the same gods of Easter Island, of New Zealand, and also Egypt, and by definition and by description, also the same people in Mesopotamia, which were the Anunnaki. So again, we're going back to this tradition of having one group of people going by different names all around the world, but they're all completely linked.
Freddie, would you also say that when we talk about these gods of South America, Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, there's another one called Itzamna, are we talking about many gods or just one?
I thought it was just one, and until I spoke to a very, very good Maya teacher in the Yucatan called Miguel Vergara. We do a lot of tours together. He is a walking encyclopedia, and he's piecing together the original Maya traditions, literally page by page, and we were discussing this, and he said, no, they're actually three different people. But it's interesting that they all arrived in the Yucatan Peninsula at the same time, and in fact there's a date which is given in the Chilambalam. It's 9,600 BC, so within 100 years of the Great Flood, we have three groups of gods, three groups of 7 people who arrive on serpent rafts, because that was also their nickname, the people of the serpents, and it had nothing to do with snakes whatsoever. It was to do with the fact that they were basically in control of the laws of nature, and that was the symbol of the serpent. And Quetzalcoatl basically went north, Kukulkan went to the middle, and the Itza, under this god called Itzamna, that hardly anyone knows about, they set up the original temple cities, which we now call Chichen Itza. That's where the name comes from. They went to Tikal, they went into central Guatemala, and then they set up shop there, and they called their new homeland Lake Atitlan, which gives you a clue of where they came from, which of course was the Atlantic and the original landmass, which is Atitlan, or as we know it quite well, Atlantis. So they were very homesick to get the civilization restarted in Central America, and I quote, they went there to rebuild the former mansions of the gods. So everything that we see today in Central America, although it's been rebuilt again and again and again, it literally is a mirror image of what they had before. And so far, we have uncovered, 30,000 temple cities in the jungles between Yucatan and Guatemala and Belize. So there was a huge civilization there, and they literally had to start from scratch. They had to rebuild what had been drowned before.
Let's go to Joe now in Long Island, New York, to get things started east of the Rockies. Hey, Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, Freddie, a couple of questions. I'm just speculating, but I'm wondering if there's any way to derive what the ships were. I doubt there would be shipwrecks that go that far back, but that would be the first question. Second question would be in the Solomon Islands specifically, would there have been any way to canvass the islands and find giants, being that, there was limited circumference? And also, are there any associated animals with these people that are symbolic or actually effective and maybe magical, such as, there's a lot of mystery with the eagle?
Wow, that's three questions. I can answer the last one pretty quickly. I don't know that one. The ships, yes, they're going to be pretty hard to find. I mean, these things apparently were built of wood.
Disintegrated at the bottom of the ocean by now.
Yeah, unless they're encased in mud, and the lucky turn of the archaeologist spade comes across them, it'll be fantastic because they will be preserved in some way or another. But I can say during my research that they do describe them as being, they traveled without oars across the ocean, and in the Hopi traditions they describe them as actually floating over the ocean. And again, we don't know if this was a sort of an image or a metaphor. There was one case where they described huge sails, which is the tradition of the Waitaha in Easter Islands, and apparently the massive catamarans that they have today in Tonga and Samoa, and they are impressive catamarans, by the way. They're supposed to be echoes of the original canoes of the gods. They call them the wakas, by the way. That's the original term for them. But they said that they basically were very stable. They were huge. They could have 200-300 people on these massive catamarans, and they got around the Pacific effortlessly, as Tor Heyerdahl obviously proved during one of his voyages on a raft that he took from the coast of South America all the way to Easter Island. And the other question
About the giants.
about the giants, this is fascinating because there are a lot of stories, even today, that the giants are still living in pockets inside the caves of the mountains of the Solomon Islands. And you think, this should be pretty easy to find out. Well, it turns out that the Solomon Islands are actually quite remote. They're very hard to get to. There's no roads that really go anywhere into the Central Highlands, unless there's a logging road or a mining road. But there were people who were doing mining there that said that on one occasion, and I believe it was a group of Americans who were there, and they said that one of our trucks actually veered off one of the dirt roads during a storm, and we had to walk all the way back to town. It was about 20-30 miles. We had to go back and get a hinch and some equipment to get the truck out of this ditch, and when they got back there, the truck had been turned upright and back on the road. And the local people said, oh, this happens all the time. That was the giants that basically helped you. They're very shy. They keep themselves to themselves, and they live in these massive caves systems. They go through the cave systems, and they get around from A to B because the type of stone inside the caves is self-illuminating. And I heard that story again in the original Mesopotamian story of the flood, where you have two of the flood the gods who Yima was one of them. Noah was his counterpart in the Bible, but that wasn't his real name. Yima said that he had a window that was self-illuminating inside his boat. And I'm wondering if this is perhaps the same type of stone that exists in certain parts of the world that does give off a certain luminous quality in the dark. But certainly they say that they're still living there. We leave them alone. They leave us alone. They're very disconcerting because they're about 18 feet tall. And I've heard exactly the same story in the island of Tongareva, where the team of Osaka, from the University of Osaka, they went there to dig up some of the giants' graves. And this is a small island in the middle of the Cook Islands group. And this was about 15 years ago. I had this on personal information, direct information from the last wisdom keeper of Tongareva, and he said, my mother actually witnessed them digging up this 22-foot long grave where there must have been a skeleton that was 18 feet long. And the archaeologists dug up the bones. They found urns and other pottery in there, perfectly preserved. And then there was a massive voice that came out, booming out of the lagoon that said, you've seen enough. Time to put back the artifacts and go away. You're desecrating our grave. And it frightened the archaeologists so much that when I contacted them in Osaka, they said, we do not wish to go back with that story again. Just drop the story. We don't want to talk about it. But it's on record that they actually found an 18-foot giant buried in the island of Tongareva. So they do keep washing up in the north coast of New Zealand as well, and they were still living there as far as the 18th century, according to the Maori records.
Let's go to Bill now, truck driving in the state of Washington. Hi, Bill. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, Freddie. Hey, George. No, this is a great topic, and I got so many questions. But, just recently they discovered a human fossil in the Apatema Caves in Greece, and that's on the Mani Peninsula. And what's really interesting about that is the religion of Manichaeism. Manichaeism is from what we call the Near East. They had a huge following. But Mani was depicted as being 100 feet tall. Well, we can laugh about that now, and that's a dead religion, obviously, but, it had a huge following. Manichaeism was huge. And I guess my point is, there's an old saying that the oracle is not where the power is. The power is with the priest, even if they have to invent the oracle. All right, and what we've done is we put religion, and especially Christianity, in this small context. This really just relates to the 20th century, and no, this is really interesting what you're doing. And there's also like the Beringia hypothesis. These human fossils were hunter-gatherers that were moving, chasing game from point to point over the grassy, the grassy steppe-lands. But that does not account for the massive civilizations that emerged. Like the Beringia hypothesis is, there's a lost continent under the Bering Sea. And now that would account for the massive human civilizations that arose in North and South America. But, my question is simply, have you heard of the Tabby star and the occultation of the light that's coming from that star? Do you believe that could be a massive technological apparatus by this extraterrestrial civilization? And then my other thing, I'd like to get your opinion on the Chachapoya and the sarcophagi in Peru. Those are also very, really mysterious as far as their origins.
All right, Freddie, take a few of those if you want.
Ooh, those subjects are sort of slightly outside my sphere of understanding. I'd have to give you an opinion, and there's so many opinions already, but what I can say related to some of the topics that you were bringing up was that we are not going to find most of the places where these gods lived. And this was said to me directly. It was the most expensive phone call I've ever made to this tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, to this wisdom keeper. And he said, because you have to understand that, when the civilization was here, civilization that we inherited, because suddenly, even NASA described this in a study back in 1972. They were fascinated as to how humans suddenly developed civilization spontaneously around the world around 8000 BC. We inherited megalithic structures. We inherited astronomy, astrology, mythology, mathematics. It's as though we're all having the same hallucination. And his point was, yes, there was a civilization here before. There were many civilizations here before, but you won't find them. Because what went down, something had to go up. So where there was a Sahara today, there used to be an ocean there, and that obviously drained into the Atlantic. The same in Arabia as well. In fact, he was making the point that the home of the Anunnaki, which is one of my big questions, used to be an island where today's Arabian Peninsula now sits, which really blew my mind. I had no idea that was coming. And he said the same thing in the Pacific. You talk to the Hopi and the Zuni, and they'll say, absolutely, we came from an island whose, it's 2:30 in the morning my time. I can't remember the name of it, but it's somewhere around the area where Samoa is today. All of that's gone. All we see today are the peaks of these massive land masses, and something else had to go up in its stead. So places like, Bolivia, that rose in a blink of an eye according to the local traditions, and yes, part of Lake Titicaca is still salty. There are many lakes that have salt water where there shouldn't be salt water, and they're saying these things literally rose in the blink of an eye, because when you have that much destruction with meteorites colliding with the Earth and 3-mile-high tsunamis, which can be proved, you're going to show that the geology that we have today bears no resemblance to what we had back then. So the remains of the civilization remain in the traditions and the mythology, except the mythology is nothing more than the theatrical method with which to tell you a history of a people. So yes, there is plenty of evidence to show that the original stories of the indigenous people are closer to the reality of what we've inherited in the West today.
And that object that some people think might be artificial, I think is probably just some huge asteroid flying
And who
around.
knows, but the one thing that I did find, and this is a huge revelation, was how all of these gods, without exception around the world, are all related to each other by Orion. The name Orion keeps popping up again and again and again. And now, I've been around the block enough times to realize that things should be taken literally, and I thought, okay, maybe they're talking about the symbol, or maybe they're talking metaphorically, but the more indigenous people I've spoken to when I was researching the material for this book was, oh, no. This was a physical connection. They actually had the ability to go backwards and forwards physically from this constellation, and we interacted with these people. And after the flood, their messengers helped us survive. They had set us on our course to human civilization, and then they vanished. They just disappeared. And they'll show up once in a while just to check in and make sure that we're okay. And I had this conversation with Clifford Mahuti of the Zuni tribe, and he said, yeah, I mean, they still show up in their flying shields once in a while, checking in, making sure things are fine. They still give us information, but there was a time back in the day when they could get backwards and forwards between the belt stars of Orion by some mechanism that is now hidden or lost. And they said also that once in a while they will take one lucky human being with them to show them how to live in harmony, and then bring them back to Earth and say, now teach your peers what you've experienced and be the example you wish to see. And that's how they did it. That's how they helped us go from barbarity to civilization.
Now, I would go if I could come back relatively soon. Wouldn't you?
Absolutely. But they're saying all in its right time. Every stage on the Earth has its own particular time, and the Tamil culture and the Indian culture agrees with this. They're saying that we're now in the time of the Kali Yuga. We have to go into godlessness and into war and into conflict in order to recognize what we've lost.
Hold on, Freddie. We're coming back for final calls in a moment. The Missing Lands will tell you where you can get the book when we come right back.
Coast Insiders, the new version of the Coast to Coast AM app, is now available for iPhone and now Android 4.0 and above. Listen live or on demand, anywhere, anytime. Go to coasttocoastam.com and download it today.
Templeton, so make sure you're part of the program. We're going to come back in a moment with Freddie Silver and take final phone calls as we talk about his work, The Missing Lands. Coast Insiders, if you miss a program, of course, you can always go back and listen again.
Hi, this is Angelina in Redondo Beach, and I love being a coast-to-coast insider because I can tune in at any time of day.
Hi, I'm Julio from Information.
Hey,
Hi,
Julio.
this is Ariel from San Diego,
Hey,
California.
Ariel. How you doing?
And I love being a
Glad to
Coast
hear it.
Insider because I can listen to any show, anytime, anywhere, if I'm in the garden or in the kitchen, taking a walk on the beach.
Glad to hear it,
And
Ariel.
there's no more sleepless
Glad
nights
to
for me.
meet you.
It's amazing. Give it a try.
Give it a try. How do?
Tell you
Website,
what,
it's
George,
15
I'm gonna
cents a
give it a
day, and
try.
sign up at Coast to Coast AM.
Growth. You've heard us talk to
There we
Dr.
go.
Nathan Newman about skincare products using stem cell
This is what
technology
George
and
Norrie
other
is using
natural
on his upper
ingredients.
lip there.
Now, he has developed Reveal, spelled RVL.
With Freddie Silva, as we talk about his work, The Missing Lands. Freddie, where do people get your book, by the way?
Oh, they get it straight from the author. Important to support the authors these days, and
Sure
you'll find
is.
it on my website, which is invisibletemple.com.
Excellent. Back to the calls we go. Carol's with us now in Tallahassee, Florida. Hey, Carol, good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, 2:30 here. So much information. Thank you so
I'm glad
much.
you're awake as I am.
Yeah, so much
You
information.
both better be awake.
Well, you've kept me awake. So
Good.
much information you've got that fits in with all the information I've accumulated over the years. I first came across information on Lemuria, which came to be known as the lost continent called Mu, symbolized by the script letter M. Back in the 70s, I came across a book called God, what was it? Written by Richard Keener, called The Ultimate Frontier. The continent was so huge that it also incorporated parts of what's now southwestern Australia, which, according to the images I pulled up in the history that I read, was actually swampland. Its highest point in altitude actually was supposed to be what is now Hawaii. They did colonize, and they colonized. They did go across the ocean. They went to South America and parts of Western America. And I've also got books that I've read by James Churchward, who incorporated and confirmed that information in South America, I think, in the 1800s. I don't know if you've ever heard of that book, The Ultimate Frontier, but I have another question about, I'm confused about Atlantis. It seems to have been located, according to different sources, in different parts of the planet, and I believe Plato wrote about it. Can you say a bit more about Atlantis?
What do we know about Atlantis, Freddie?
Basically, the traditions have, depending on who you're talking to, and I'm not talking about the academics now, so I'm going back to the original source material as far back as I can find. There are certain overlapping traditions here, and they often confuse three different events into one. We have to understand that there was three major catastrophes that spanned the period of about 3,500 years. They're called the Dryas periods. So there was the oldest Dryas, there was the old Dryas, and then the younger Dryas. This is the last one is the one that everyone keeps talking about recently. And basically, the three major catastrophes involve not just the global flood, which is 11,000 years ago, but also a flipping of the Earth on its axis. And I'm not talking about the magnetic field, I'm talking about the actual poles flipping. And there are several traditions around the world. Again, if these people weren't speaking to each other, their stories are identical, that the poles literally flipped upside down and the Earth went to a massive deep freeze. And it seems to come back the other way again over time. So the net result is that there's a lot of confusion as to where these land masses were. Originally, they were like a Lemuria or Mul, as they call them in South America, and they still talk about it in the Andes, by the way. They still talk about Mul in classrooms and the Aymara people. And they said, yeah, there used to be a huge landmass, but that was a long, long, long time ago. We're talking 30,000 years. As the oceans keep rising, the landmass keeps disappearing, and new land masses keep appearing. So with regard to Atlantis, the same thing happened as well. Much of it was occupying the central Atlantic ridge, according to the traditions that the Maya inherited, which is where the word, of course, Atlantis comes from. It comes from Atl. They weren't very big on vowels back then. And that's where the group called the Its came from that settled the Yucatan. The name literally means a magician priest. And but even then they were saying it wasn't just the fact that there was an island in the middle of the Atlantic. There were also portions which was where the Sahara now is. There were other sections of islands also in the North Atlantic. You can't really begin to understand where this landmass was because so much of it has shifted over time. But certainly the central portion was definitely in the middle of the Atlantic ridge. But the influence of the Atlantean culture certainly was much far spread because we hear about the Atlantean culture also being in the Mediterranean. I just came back from Sardinia and found some very interesting connections to that culture there, and also to the Anu, and also to the Shining people there, and the monuments that they left behind. But they were also saying that that's not exactly where Atlantis was. That's like one of their outposts, because the civilization was so large that they spread out, and that's where the confusion comes in. That some people even saying that it went as far as Egypt. Yes and no. The influence of the culture went as far as today's Egypt, but the Atlantis, the actual island was not there. And just to make the story even more confusing and interesting at the same time, there was a sister island which is also now in the region where the Arabian Peninsula now is, which is the home to the Shining Ones, which is their nickname, also called the followers of Horus, also called the Lords of Anu or the Anunnaki, or if you're an Indian, the Anunnaki, which means that they are a people of the serpent. So it is a confusing picture, but we're talking a spread here of over 40,000 years. In that time, geology has taken a very, very drastic turn on the Earth.
Why do you think, Freddie, we have had this lost knowledge? It just simply vanished, or, you investigate, you've picked up a lot of tidbits and facts, but generally it's gone, like how the pyramids were constructed. What happened?
You find it in dribs and drabs. I mean, what the traditions were saying was that the catastrophe was so overwhelming, the flood was so overwhelming that so much of the information is either buried or literally just destroyed. And we keep finding fragments of it here and there when the lucky turn of the geologist's spade suddenly uncovers something, and we're just, it's almost like we're looking through the vestiges of someone's rubbish bin. But there's so much more going on that's now, 50, 100, 200 feet below the surface in sediment underneath the ocean. Robert Schock and I have had this discussion for many occasions, and he's saying, if you consider that most of these people lived on islands, which is my theory all along, well, if the island sank, there's very little chance that we're going to find anything unless we dredge something up. And luckily enough, back in, I think it was the 60s, there was a vessel off the islands of the Azores, which is supposedly the tips of the original landmass of Atlantis. They dredged up from 6,000 feet rocks and sand and parts of vegetation which used to be shoreline in 15,000 BC, and that was before the first major collapse of Atlantis. So again, it's pure luck that we find this stuff, but the biggest information is in the myth. You have to understand what myth is. Myth is a theatrical device for encapsulating historical events in a way that the audience can remember from age to age. Because if you and I were just talking about some guy traveling the galaxy to fight for good and evil, you go, well, that's kind of fun, but I'm not going to remember that. But if you dress that up as Star Wars, we're still talking about it 40 years later.
You got it. Yep.
And that's what Plato was good at. He was able to take the information that he was given through a Greek historian called Solon, who was given the information by the Egyptians. And Plato, being an initiate of the mystery school, said, I've got a great mechanism that would allow us to remember this story if people who are interested enough will read between the lines. So, of course, the academics will say, well, it's just myth, it's nonsense. But no, if you read between the lines and you're a geologist, you go, well, let's check this out. Well, yes, we do have sedimental information and evidence from the mid-Atlantic ridge that, yes, that part of the ridge was dry land in 15,000 BC before the first fall of Atlantis. So suddenly, Plato's story makes a lot of sense.
Let's go to JD in Indianapolis. Hi, JD. Go ahead.
Okay. I hope I wasn't having a senior moment, but I thought I heard Mr. Silva say that there's some kind of connection between the Arabic word for the constellation Orion and the word Nephilim. Is that?
It's old Aramaic. The old Aramaic word for Orion is Nephila.
And what's interesting too is Cairo means Mars. Which is fascinating. JD, did you have another question, sir? Nope, I guess not. Let's go
definitely have you seen your moment.
Let's go to Walter.
But it was a good one.
Allentown, Pennsylvania. Walter, go ahead.
Hi, George. It's always great to talk
to you. Walt. How are you?
Good. George, I agree with Mr. Silva when he said that there was obviously a sharing of information vis-a-vis the quote-unquote the great epic tale of the flood with the ancient Hebrews vis-a-vis the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. They all had their epic tales of how they came about and whatnot. Now, you were just, I agree with Mr. Silva when he says that mythology is a way of conveniently conveying science, if you want to use the word scientific in quotes, at that point there was no real science, but it was a way of conveying information from one generation to the next. But the problem is, from today's viewpoint, you can't let the myth and religion substitute for science. George, I mean, obviously, George, you know where I'm coming from. Mankind, in my view, must come to the humbling, self-deprecating realization that we are the quintessential naked ape, George. And if we don't come to that realization, we're going to lose it all because, you have people over there with they're in a dark age of mentality, and they have their fingers on nuclear weapons.
Well, they sure do. As a matter of fact, North Korea did a little launch today of another short-range missile, indeed. But
oh, what fun! It's all theater. No, but I kind of agree. I think that it takes, in order to get to the truth, I think we have to look at this from a multidisciplinary point of view, which is the view that I usually take when I'm writing a book. I like to look at different points of view. I like to blend in geology. I like to blend in archaeology, academia. I like to blend in myth, so religion. And then when you sit back and take yourself out of the picture and approach the whole, all the information and the evidence not judgmentally, you let the facts speak for themselves, and then you may be in a position to determine what the truth may be. And even then, we will only be scratching at the truth, because eventually, in any subject, only the people directly involved with any event know the actual truth. We're just trying to approximate the truth. We're hoping, as researchers, that we got the information correct, and we try to put the pieces together without our particular opinion in order to approximate the actual truth. So I totally agree. I don't think you can approach this subject from just a mythological point of view. I think science has to come into it, but science by itself can't explain most of the things that existed 10, 20, 30,000 years ago, and even most scientists, if you get them off the record, will also agree that so much science, so much new information is coming out so quickly that we're having to change our perception of what science thinks to be the truth, because the evidence is shifting the parameters literally by the day. There's a new discovery happening every single day that is reshaping our understanding of how history works. So I think it's an evolving theory, what happened in the flood, and also with the civilization that was here before. And the more people approach the subject, the more we add to that pot of information, the more decisions we can make based on actual evidence, which comes from a multidisciplinary point of view.
But you can say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Freddie, the flood did happen.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you have 184 separate cultures around the world that describe it in exactly the same way, in the same method, even in Australia, I have 4 different stories from different Aboriginal people watching the waves coming from different points along the coasts and meeting in the center. And then we have the actual ballistics experts at Los Alamos that say, yes, a projectile of a certain size hitting, let's say, off the coast of Peru will generate a wave that is 3 miles high. And these people work, with peer-reviewed magazines and journals, and I've actually got the information in the book that speaks it in their own words. So when they're talking about in Tibet, watching the waves crossing the Himalaya, they were not making this up. These were eyewitness accounts. And that's what I find very plausible. And even geologists, and some of them, I won't mention their names because I don't want to put them on record, they'll say that, the earth has shifted so much in 12,000 years that even we are approximating what may have happened. Because if there was water, so much of the evidence has washed away. If there was a lot of water moving across the globe, then land masses would have shifted very, very quickly. And if anyone is listening here from New Zealand, you will know that 2 years ago, in 1 minute, on the South Island, with one earthquake, which was a 7.0 earthquake, you inherited 12 feet of coastline. I'm not talking about length. I'm talking about a rise in the seabed by 12 feet. That's in 1 minute. So imagine what a big wave will do.
In the last minute we have here, Freddie, the Bible talked about this flood being 40 days and 40 nights. What would have caused that? Just a constant barrage of these comets, or what?
It was the basic, it's like when, if you remember when you're a young kid and you're in the bathtub and you're sort of moving your body in and out of the bathtub and you're watching the water slap across the sides of the bathtub and over the edge. That's essentially what was happening. There was ripples going around. Water was hitting coastlines. It was hitting mountains. It was going to and fro. It took a long time for the water to settle. It took time for land masses to readjust to the new reality, and also for water to go where it hadn't been before, and for water to also to go where it hadn't been before. So there was a complete realignment of the earth, as though basically the whole thing was made of jello. So imagine the whole thing having to spend some time settling down, the geology settling down back to its normal method. And in fact, if you look at some of the traditions in the Yucatan and compare them to what they were saying in China, they were saying that in the Yucatan, that the Earth, when 3 days and 7 days after the flood hit, that the sun stood still in the sky for 7 days.
Yeah, it was amazing. Freddie, thank you so much. The book is called The Missing Lands. Up next, a moment of inspiration. Don't go away.